axe was left downstairs, raw bacon laying on the floor, mirrors covered with sheets, food at the table, cigarette butts in the attic, bloody water, just tons of crime scene, all destroyed by half the town, wandering around looking at it. At that point, half the town, the victims' families, thought Jones did it. Meanwhile, state and local authorities are building a case against Reverend Kelly, the schizophrenic traveling minister.
On the night of June 9, 1912, the quiet town of Villisca, Iowa, was rocked by a brutal and mysterious crime. The bodies of 6 members of the Moore family and 2 young house guests were discovered the following morning, hacked to death with an axe. Despite a large-scale investigation, multiple theories, and a series of arrests, the case of the Villisca Axe Murders remains unsolved. More than a century later, the eerie mystery continues to fascinate true crime enthusiasts, with some even claiming that the ghosts of the victims haunt the house where the murders occurred. Villisca, Iowa, in 1912, was a small, picturesque town with a population of just over 2,000 people. Located in the southwestern part of the state, it was a close-knit community where everyone knew everyone else. The town's peaceful atmosphere made the horrifying events of that night even more shocking. At the heart of the story was the Moore family. Joe Moore, a well-respected local businessman, had worked as a successful farmer and hardware store owner. His wife, Sarah, was known for her warm, nurturing nature. Together, they had 4 children: Herman, 11, Mary, 10, Arlene, 7, and Paul, 5. That fateful evening, the Moore family had invited 2 young house guests, Lena and Ina Stillinger, ages 12 and 8, to spend the night with them. The 2 girls were the daughters of a nearby family, and their visit was a typical arrangement in the small town. The Moores had attended a church service on the evening of June 9, 1912. After the service, they invited the Stillinger girls to stay over, which wasn't unusual. The family returned home around 9:30 p.m., and the 2 young girls followed them back to the Moore house, located at 508 2nd Street. The 2 families would go to bed, seemingly unaware of the horrific fate awaiting them. The morning of June 10, 1912, began like any other for Villisca. The local townspeople went about their daily routines, unaware of the gruesome discovery awaiting them. That morning, Josiah Moore's neighbor, Mary Peckham, went to the Moore houses to see if the family was awake. It was unlike them to miss church, and she had been concerned when she hadn't seen them earlier. When she arrived at the houses, she knocked on the door but received no response. After trying unsuccessfully to reach the family, she used a spare key to enter the houses. Inside, she discovered a scene of unspeakable horror. The bodies of 8 people were found in various rooms of the house, each one struck in the head with an axe. The victims were all lying in their beds, covered by blankets and sheets, making the discovery even more chilling. It appeared as though the killer had crept into their rooms during the night and slaughtered them while they slept. The brutality of the murders left no room for doubt. Whoever was responsible had shown a complete disregard for human life. The bodies of Josiah and Sarah Moore were found in the master bedroom, each one struck multiple times with the axe. The Moore children were found in their respective rooms, as was Lena and Ina Stillinger, the young house guests. The murder weapon was found in the guest bedroom, where the Stillinger girls were killed. Despite the severity of the crime, there were no signs of forced entry into the house. The doors had been locked from the inside, and there were no indications of a struggle. The killer had apparently gone to great lengths to ensure that the murders went unnoticed for as long as possible. After the slaughter, the killer had turned the axe on the victims' faces, obscuring their identities. The killer then covered the bodies with sheets and blankets before leaving the scene in silence. As news of the murder spread throughout Villisca, the town was plunged into a state of shock and fear. How could something so brutal happen in such a small, peaceful community? A local police force, unfamiliar with handling such a heinous crime, quickly began their investigation, but they were out of their depth. Soon, law enforcement from nearby towns and the Iowa State Police joined the investigation, but the case quickly grew more complicated. The initial investigation revealed little. There were no signs of robbery, no obvious motive, and no clues that could point to a suspect. The killer had carefully wiped down the axe, and no fingerprints were found at the scene. There were no witnesses, no apparent connection between the victims and anyone who might have had a motive to harm them. The only real clue was a strange detail discovered the morning of the murders. A bloody footprint was found in the dirt near the house, though it was not large enough to belong to an adult. As the investigation continued, rumors began to swirl. Some believed that the murders were the work of a serial killer. Others speculated that the killer was someone from the town, perhaps someone with a grudge against the Moore family. There were even rumors that a traveling preacher who had been in town that evening was somehow involved. Despite the efforts of law enforcement, the case remained unsolved. No suspect emerged, and no new evidence was discovered. The town, once peaceful and tranquil, was now gripped by fear. People began locking their doors at night, and the community was left to wonder, who had committed such a brutal act? Why had they done it? And most importantly, would they strike again? Over the years, the investigation into the Villisca Axe Murders would uncover several potential suspects, though none would be definitively linked to the crime. One of the most prominent suspects was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher who had been in Villisca on the night of the murders. Kelly had preached at the church that the Moores had attended earlier in the evening, and some residents claimed to have seen him near the Moore house later that night. At the time of the murders, Kelly had been staying in a nearby town and was known to have been somewhat eccentric, even unstable. He had reportedly expressed strange, sometimes violent thoughts about people in the community, and several townspeople said that his behavior had raised suspicions. Kelly was questioned about the murders, but there was no concrete evidence linking him to the crime. In 1917, he was put on trial for the murders, but he was acquitted due to a lack of evidence. Although Kelly was never convicted, many people still consider him one of the most likely suspects. His potential motive remains unclear, but some theorists speculate that he could have been enraged by something that happened at the church service earlier that evening. Another suspect in the case was Frank Jones, a local businessman and former employer of Josiah Moore. The two men had reportedly had a falling out, and some believed that Jones might have had a motive for murder. Josiah Moore had taken business from Jones, and some sources suggested that Jones may have been angry enough to take violent action. In 1914, Frank Jones was briefly investigated and even accused of having a role in the murders. However, there was no hard evidence to prove his involvement, and the case against him eventually dissolved. Other theories point to the possibility that the killer was an outsider who had traveled to Villisca specifically to commit the murders. The fact that the killer had carefully wiped down the axe and left no clear trace of evidence suggested that they were familiar with the area or had prepared meticulously for the crime. One such theory suggests that the killer was a transient or vagrant who had passed through the town on the night of the murders, committing the brutal crime before quickly fleeing. Unfortunately, no witnesses came forward with any information that could definitively identify an outsider as the perpetrator. Theories and speculation. Was the Villisca Axe murderer a serial killer? As the years passed, the Villisca Axe murders became a source of fascination and speculation. Some have suggested that the killer may have been a serial killer, perhaps responsible for other unsolved murders in the region. There were reports of similar murders occurring in other states in the years following the Villisca killings, with victims being bludgeoned to death in their homes by an axe or similar weapon. However, no definitive links were ever made between these crimes and the Villisca case. Others have speculated that the Villisca Axe murderer was mentally unstable or driven by a deep personal vendetta against the Moore family. Whether the killer was a local, a transient, or even someone with a grudge against the town, the mystery remains unsolved, and the case continues to haunt those who study it. Today, the house where the murders took place still stands in Villisca, preserved as a historical site and paranormal hotspot. The house is open to the public for tours, and many visitors report strange occurrences, cold spots, eerie noises, and the feeling of being watched. Some claim to have encountered the spirits of the Moore family and their guests, with reports of disembodied voices and unexplained footsteps. The murders, once the subject of quiet rumors, have become part of the town's folklore. The house itself has become a symbol of the unsolved mystery, with many curious visitors coming to witness the eerie atmosphere and learn about the brutal crime that occurred there over a century ago.